Chapter 9. Bzz, bzz, bzz. Nick groaned and wriggled under his blankets, finally shoving an arm out into the open to grope for the phone. It stopped vibrating for 10 fucking seconds, and he groggily considered the pros and cons of just withdrawing his arm and pretending he hadn't heard it. Then the buzzing started again. He groaned again, more irritably, and finally got hold of the thing. He squinted at the too-bright screen. It was still dark in the room. What time was it? The caller was Vash. Nick answered. Red's Roses is on fire. Nick stared into the darkness for a long second, trying to put the words together into solid concepts in his half-asleep brain. Then he shot upright and barked, "What?" He got himself up and out the door in record time. No coffee, no cigarette. The sleet storm had ended sometime in the night, but the roads were still slick with the stuff. Road crews hadn't gotten around to salting everywhere yet. He felt every second of how slowly he took the route to Vash's neighborhood, but if he rushed and got in a wreck, Vash would absolutely kill him. When he got there, Vash opened the door and ushered him inside. It was barely 6 o'clock. The sun had only just slipped over the horizon. "What the hell happened?" Nick asked immediately. Vash looked complicated. Too many things at once. Spooked and scared, yes, but also not at all shocked, and largely sad. He turned and led the way to the kitchen, where he had a pot of coffee already made. He got down a second mug and filled it without asking, then picked up his own, already half drunk. "I don't know," Vash said. "Elendira called Knives. He woke me up, but he wouldn't wait for me." "He went over there?" Vash nodded. He got out his phone and tapped a few times, then turned it to Nick. It was only a 4-second video clip, but it was enough to see the flames leaping from the back of the shop's roof, the flashing emergency lights in the foreground. Nick swore. Vash looked at his phone again. He looked so tired, not a hint of masking cheer to be seen. "No explanations yet," Knives says. "But no one was inside. Elendira's fine. Had to have started 2-3 hours ago, maybe right after the storm ended. That's why the sleet didn't put it out." Nick looked at him for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Convenient." Vash's nostrils flared, his lips thinned. He took a sip of his coffee, still looking at his phone. "Storms can cause water to get in walls," he said, totally neutral. "Short the wiring." "How's Elendira's building maintenance?" Nick asked. "Immaculate," Vash said. "So," said Nick, "what's your opinion?" Vash's eyes tightened. He put his phone back on the counter and wrapped his real arm around his stomach, coffee in his prosthetic hand. He was wearing a long-sleeved thermal shirt, and had clearly had enough time to get his arm on. Nick wondered if some of his cool attitude this morning was because Knives hadn't wanted to wait around for Vash to put himself together. It probably made Vash feel useless, or like a burden. "I don't know," Vash said, staring at the refrigerator. "I keep going back and forth. I know I don't like that Knives went out by himself, in the dark." Nick wanted to say, even if he'd gotten attacked, what good would it do if you got attacked too? But that was pure selfishness, so he didn't say it. If there was only one stalker, at least having 2 targets would be a deterrent. Nick found himself mainly irritated at Knives' recklessness, and at how unthinkingly he'd hurt Vash by leaving. Nick sighed and stepped forward, arms out. Vash's face softened a little, and he put his coffee down to accept the hug. He sighed against Nick's shoulder and said, "I don't know. Things just happen." He sounded like he was trying to convince himself. "Can't worry about what you can't know," Nick told him. He rubbed Vash's back. "Gotta wait and see if any better information comes out." Vash hummed affirmation, but didn't let Nick out of the hug for a long time. Finally, they had to concede to getting ready for the rest of the day. Vash disappeared to finish getting dressed, while Nick drank his now lukewarm coffee and called Jessica to let her know the news. They were going to have a scramble ahead of them to figure out an alternative flower vendor. She was aghast and wanted all sorts of details he had no possible way of knowing. It grated on his nerves, and he tried not to take it out on her, but by the time he hung up, he was fairly irritable, and craving. He headed for the back door, digging out his cigarettes, and then hunting, cursing, for the lighter that was still missing. His lighter was missing. His stomach felt like it plummeted over the top of a roller coaster without the rest of him. He caught himself in the doorframe, frozen, thinking, "What? No. No, unrelated. How could it? There's no way. No." But he'd never lost his lighter before. He carefully put his hands into each pocket, testing their seams, and felt no holes. It was the same suit jacket from yesterday, same coat. New pants, yes, he changed his pants, but he never put the lighter or the cigarettes in his pants pockets, ever, because the smokes were more likely to get crushed and the lighter made a weird bulge. And he'd last had the lighter in his hand after lunch, but before the service, yes. Quick smoke break right before service prep really kicked into gear. So, late afternoon? 4:30? He almost turned on his heel, walked back into the house to tell Vash. But tell him what, exactly? A misplaced lighter wasn't a clue like this was some goddamn detective mystery. The only reason it had struck him so strongly, engendered such abrupt fear, was because he already had fire on the mind. Uneasily, he let go of the doorframe and retreated into the kitchen. He glanced around, but he wasn't going to go searching for matches in Vash's drawers, and besides, the craving had been knocked momentarily out of him. Instead, all he could think of was what it would be like to be alone in this quiet, airy house with someone outside. Someone in the back garden, just watching the door, the kitchen window. It had closed blinds, but there were still small gaps near the edges, and Nick wondered what you could see through them, if anything. He quickly turned and headed back into the rest of the house. He stepped into the end of the hallway just as Vash emerged from his room, all bundled up against the cold. Vash furrowed his brows. "What's wrong?" "What?" Nick blinked and made an effort to relax his face, not sure what expression Vash had seen there. "Nothing," he said. "Just spooked by all this. Sorry." Vash's carefully neutral mask slid into place. "I'm sorry," he said. "Shouldn't have got you involved in this. Could have called later." Nick's attention all snapped to Vash immediately, and he strode down the hallway. Vash's eyes went wide as Nick got right up in his face. Nick only paused for a moment to gauge whether Vash was receptive or not before pressing his lips to the other man's. Vash didn't retreat. He accepted the kiss passively for a moment, and then his hand surged up to wrap tight around handfuls of the front of Nick's coat, and he walked Nick backwards into the nearest wall, kissing him hard, urgent. What Nick had only intended to convey, "Hush, you're being ridiculous," turned quickly into something very different. Sublimated panic, maybe, a disorienting and terrifying wake-up call sliding into what promised to be a miserable, crisis-driven day, all under the pall of one big, terrifying unknown factor. Vash kissed like he wanted to get back in bed and hide, maybe with Nick, maybe all day, just pull the covers over his head and ignore everything else. Nick couldn't blame him. He wrapped his arms around Vash's neck and kept him in the bubble of shared breaths between them, indulging in the urge for long minutes, until the kisses started to ease up, slow down a little. Arousal tickled up Nick's spine, walking up the vertebrae like a lover's fingers. He finally pulled back from Vash's face, because there was a time for that, but this wasn't it. The miserable, crisis-driven day awaited them. "It'll be okay," he told Vash quietly. "It's gonna be fine." Vash let out a long, shaky breath. "Yeah," he said at last. "One thing at a time," Nick said, and tugged Vash's silly hat by the ear flaps. "Let's get out of here." Vash shut his eyes and nodded. It was a long day. Vash opened the garden center short-handed, just him and Kite, because Knives didn't come back until late in the afternoon. Nick imagined that whatever was going on between Knives and Ellendear was being tested right now, or possibly forged in fire into something stronger. But at least Knives texted every now and then, and Vash kept Nick up to speed. Because everything had been wet with sleet, and all the greenery inside a florist tends to be, well, green, the fire didn't end up doing as much damage as it could have. The back room with all the supplies for fulfilling big orders had gone up like a torch, being full of florist foam, twine, ribbon, tissue, and dry filler. But as soon as that tinder had burned out, the cold and damp had kept the fire from catching much else. Still, even though the structure would be salvageable, the interior was an absolute ruin. Vash forwarded a picture that made Nick wince. The place would need to be gutted. The water damage from the fire hoses looked worse than the fire damage itself. Jessica spent all day chomping at the bit for details, which eventually got on everyone's nerves. Brad talked to her quietly at one point, and after that she stopped asking every half hour if anyone had heard anything new, but she also sulked for a while afterwards. Business trucked along as usual, but the atmosphere was mildly unpleasant in the offices all day. Not helped by the scramble for a new florist, and the dozen calls Nick had to make to various families to say that no, sorry, this thing they'd already put a lot of difficult, emotionally fraught time and effort into planning was all ruined now, and he needed input from them on how to start over. Most were understanding and aghast at the news of the fire, but a couple of people were real entitled pieces of shit and gave Nick a hell of a headache. He smoked too much, angry at everything, head throbbing. For months, his max per day had been 6, easing towards capping off at 4. Today started with 2 mid-morning, and, after all the damn phone calls, 3 smokes and a pack of ramen just to make his stomach shut up. In the kitchen, Brad gave him a look that Nick was pretty sure was concern, and started to open his mouth, probably to tell Nick he wasn't taking care of himself right, as if Nick didn't know that. But Nick disappeared into his office too fast to be caught in a web of coddling. Late afternoon he was outside, having just chain-lit the day's 9th cigarette off the remains of the 8th, when the rust bucket sedan turned up over at the garden center. Knives got out and went inside alone, but Nick could see the silhouette of another person in the passenger seat. Without stopping to think about it, Nick pushed off from the wall and started across the street, hollowing his cheeks to draw in burning hot smoke faster. He almost made himself gag, which he hadn't done in years. Puffing a cloud along beside himself, he hopped the curb and made for the door, not even sure what exactly he was planning to do or say to Knives when he caught up with him. "Mr. Wolfwood," called a lightly accented voice. He dragged himself to a stop, turning. Elendira stepped out of the twins' car and wrapped her arms around herself, gloved hands holding her own elbows. She headed up the sidewalk towards him. She looked... Well, Nick would do her the service of not thinking too hard about how she looked, because she looked like someone whose life had just burned down, and that was all that needed to be said. "Miss Rousseau," he said, and hurriedly lowered his cigarette, flicking ash away. "I'm so sorry." She nodded. "You are coming over with some urgency," she said. "Is there something you know?" "Oh," he said, glancing at the garden center. His shoulders sagged. No, sorry. I was coming over to... I'm not even sure. Give Knives a piece of my mind." She gave him a pained look. "Why?" Nick stopped and really took stock of her. She looked like she needed a friend, and almost certainly had been in need of a friend all day. Knives had run out the door to be there for her, run off and left his disabled brother alone with no vehicle, yes, but also he'd just been running mindlessly towards someone he cared about who was in trouble. Shit. Nick couldn't fault that. He thought about the yellow flower with the dramatic burgundy splash marks. How much time that must have taken, and how long, then, this thing must have been building between Elendira and Knives. His shoulders sagged even more. He rubbed his eyes, shaking his head. No reason. No good reason. Her expression cleared a little bit. She rubbed her hands up and down her arms. "I heard his brother give him hell on the phone this morning," she said. "For going out alone." Nick dragged on his cigarette. "Yeah," he said, smoke streaming out of his mouth. He turned slightly, keeping himself angled so the wind wouldn't blow his smoke into Elendira's face. He considered for a moment. What do you know about them?" Elendira just nodded. Nick wasn't sure what she was agreeing with exactly. "He's told me," she said, "that someone wants something from him. Maybe just his attention. But that this someone wants him badly enough to hurt him, maybe. Today is the first time, I think, he's realized that this someone wants his attention so badly they might hurt someone else." Nick's stomach sank. "Is there proof, then? Arson?" She shook her head. "No. But I will never believe it wasn't set, no matter what the investigation finds." He finished the end of his cigarette and stubbed it out on the bottom of his shoe. "I think it's the safer assumption, yeah," he said. "Beats finding out how wrong you are the hard way." She gave him a thin, wan smile. "Exactly." She hesitated, then went on. Knives, he's here to tell his brother that he's staying with me for a couple of nights. Relevant information for you as well, I think, since I understand you are... involved." "Oh," said Nick. "Yeah, He paused, actually thought about this information, frowned. "Yeah, actually. Don't like the idea of Vash home alone." Behind him, a sharp voice said, "Then do something about it." Nick spun. Both twins were coming out of the side door of the garden center. Knives was glaring at Nick with his usual bitch face. Behind him, Vash reached out and slapped him on the back of the head, mouth drawn down. Knives jerked and turned his glare on his brother. Vash huffed at him. "Stop being such a dick," he said. Knives looked as baffled as he did irritated. "What? I was suggesting you spend time with him. You want that, right?" Vash gave him a pissy look. "You make everything sound like a threat," he said. "You need to do some serious mirror work." This time, Knives looked like he was about to reach out and smack Vash before he caught himself and settled down, tucking his coat straight and clearly pretending he never got in slap fights with his brother. He'd never be that immature. Sure, Nick thought. fighting an inappropriate urge to smile. "Is it settled?" Elendira asked. Knives nodded, took her arm and walked a few feet away with her, glancing back at Vash and Nick as he went. They started talking in low voices once they were out of earshot. Vash rolled his eyes after them and shook his head. "What's that about?" Nick asked. "He's going to stay at her place for a few days," Vash said, expression still pinched. "Just in case." Nick hummed with skepticism. Vash turned his pissy look on Nick this time. Nick raised his hands in casual surrender and said, "Why's he gotta act like everything that's his business is a state secret? That's all I'm asking." Vash's mouth finally twitched in a small grin. "Fine by me," he said. "I don't want to know what they're talking about over there." He jerked his head back at Knives and Elendira. "I do," Nick muttered, glancing at them. "Why are you over here anyway?" "Oh, Nick trailed off. "Actually, I was gonna give Knives shit for the way he left you, but..." He sighed and looked pointedly from the murmuring pair a few yards away back to Vash. "Love makes you stupid?" he hazarded. Almost under his breath, Vash muttered, "God, don't say the L word around him too loud." He walked a few more steps away, just to be sure. "Apparently, this has been brewing almost 2 years. How was I supposed to know? He never goes anywhere. I had no idea he had this whole virtual life going on." "Long-distance relationship when you literally work a few blocks from each other?" Nick snorted. "From what I know of him, that tracks." Vash groaned. "I don't know how we're related sometimes." Nick bumped his shoulder. "Both big dorks in different ways?" he suggested. Vash stuck his tongue out. He softened a little, which was what Nick wanted to see. "So," said Nick, "he leaving you home alone?" "Yeah. Vash reached up to scratch the back of his neck, his biggest nervous tick. "He was trying to talk me into asking to stay at yours, if the house is being watched, I guess. But I don't see how it's better for some creep to maybe figure out where you live, or Elendira." He huffed. "But he's bound and determined, so he's going, and I guess I'll..." He grimaced. "I mean, you are welcome to stay with me," Nick said. Vash flushed. "I don't mean it like I wouldn't want to," he said, tripping over his own words. "I do, I would. But... creep, watching you. I hate it," he finished lamely. Brown wrinkled, frowned back. "I just hate all of this, that's all. And I'd have to feed the cat somehow, I guess, but maybe Mrs. Ellis would do that. And all Knives' plants would die. I mean, how long is this going to be? I don't know." Nick reached out and took his hand before he could tear out any hair, what with the way he was gripping his own neck. He held it firmly and said, "You don't have to do anything you don't want. If leaving the house would make you that anxious, then don't." Vash nodded, squeezing Nick's hand, but he still looked miserable. Nick started, moved by some impulse. He paused, let the thought finish forming in the front of his mind before deciding, yeah, actually, why not? "What if I stayed with you?" he said. Vash blinked at him. "Why not?" Nick was already warming up to the idea. "I'd be your ride to work either way, and it's not like I'd be intruding on..." He jerked his thumb over his shoulder at Knives. "And there's nothing at my apartment that could die in my absence, except probably some expired milk." Vash let out a startled laugh, clearly processing the concept and finding that it sounded pretty good, actually. "Yeah," he said, almost wondering. "I haven't even... It definitely hasn't ever been an option, bringing someone back to mind, so, He laughed ruefully. "I feel like I need to clean first." "Spiky," Nick said, disbelieving. "You gotta be kidding me. You've seen my room." "Your room is clean. Your whole place is clean." Nick made a dismissive noise. "Empty ain't the same as clean," he said. "I don't have a lot of stuff, that's all. You know I don't dust what I do have." Vash grumbled but let it go, looking infinitely more cheerful already. "When am I moving in?" Nick asked, bumping him again. Vash gusted out a sigh. Tonight, I guess." "Not a problem," Nick said. "You want to ride with me after work?" "How late?" "No service tonight," Nick said. "And Livio's staying late to help in the prep room. Jess got the flower thing handled, so I could leave..." He checked his phone. 4:30. "Theoretically, I could leave now," he said. "But I need to finish some stuff." "Me too," Vash said. "Half an hour?" "You got it." Nick paused, glancing down the sidewalk at where Knives and Elendira were still talking quietly. They seemed distracted enough. He pulled Vash forward into a quick kiss, which was met with a warm laugh. A sharp whistle interrupted them, and Nick jerked back. Kite hung around the brick edge of the building, fingers in his mouth. "Hey, lover boss," Kite called. "Somebody on the phone with a question I can't answer because I'm not a huge nerd." Vash flushed pink and headed for the door, calling back, "Don't call me that! Also, you're the biggest freaking computer nerd, you hypocrite!" He disappeared inside. Down the sidewalk, Elendira was giving Nick an inscrutable little smile while Knives looked as scandalized as a wet cat. Nick tossed him a sloppy salute, smirked, and headed back to the funeral home. Nick looked past his own reflection in the front window, out into a leafy darkness studded here and there with other houses' lit windows. He leaned on the side of the window frame with one shoulder, poking a tiny hole in blinds with a finger so he could look out. There was no highway within immediate noise range. It was so quiet he could actually hear crickets. He said, "This is bizarre. Everyone's so far away." Vash walked around behind him in the living room, still working on adjusting all the grow lights and watering schedules. "Really? It took me a long time to get used to how crowded it feels here." "Did you even have neighbors on your farm?" Vash laughed. "Sure, a 20-minute bike ride down the road." Nick shook his head. St. Michael's was as isolated a place as he'd ever lived, down at the end of a dead-end cul-de-sac road in December, but it's not like that place had ever been quiet. He let the blinds fall closed and turned back into the room. Lots of the little yellow and burgundy flowers were blooming by now. He leaned down to peer at some. The insides of the flowers were almost furry, with a deep throat that went way back towards the stem. "What are these?" he asked. "Nasturtiums," Vash said. He walked up next to Nick and picked one of the flowers right off the end of the stem. Nick made a noise of alarm, and Vash grinned at him and held the flower to his face. "They're edible." Hesitantly, Nick opened his mouth and let Vash put the flower on his tongue. He bit it, and immediately his eyes tried to water and he coughed. "What?" he wheezed. "They're spicy," Vash said smugly. Nick gamely chewed up the rest of the flower and swallowed. After the initial shock, the spice level eased down into a mellow sort of tingle. The flavor was amazingly similar to cheap yellow mustard. "Huh," he said. "A few flowers torn up and mixed in a salad is pretty good," Vash said, going back to watering. "Probably shouldn't eat all of Knives' experiments, though." "What is for dinner, anyway? You want to order in?" Vash went slightly pink and said, "I thought I'd cook, if that works for you." Nick couldn't help teasing Vash for being flustered by the very concept of cooking dinner for his boyfriend, but as the evening wore on, they settled into an even playing field of amicable bickering. Vash used up the rest of the shrimp in the freezer to make some scampi with pasta, the only downside of which was that it made kissing very garlicky. Also, Vash sweet-talked Nick into peeling and deveining the shrimp, because usually Vash had to do it one-handed. His prosthetic couldn't hold on to the slippery little bastards. Watching Vash use the prosthetic while he cooked was fascinating, actually. It had a good range of hand-curling, gripping motion, but the fingers didn't move independently of each other very well. Vash explained, "If I had an elbow, I could probably do more complex hand motions, because what you do is learn to translate moving a muscle somewhere else into moving the arm parts. See?" He flexed his shoulders in a specific way, and it bent his elbow, a different way to twist his wrist. "I've seen some amazing dexterity on just forearm or hand prosthetics. There's really cool stuff out there. I could try myoelectric, which actually connects to your nerves and controlled with thought. Science is wild. But I think I'd just break it. I'm hard on these things. I don't need a lot of dexterity to lift and dig and stuff, just durability." "How is yours good at lifting weight?" Nick asked curiously. "Why doesn't it just pull off?" Vash laughed, poking at the contents of a pan with tongs. "Watch me closer, you'll see I don't really lift directly with this arm. I need an arm on that side for leverage and holding things in place, but the actual lifting is with the other hand, and then I carry any weight on my left with my shoulder or hip." Nick pondered this and had to admit, to the best of his recollection, that it was true. The very first time he'd ever seen Vash, he'd lifted something onto his left shoulder, rather than carrying it in his arms. Dinner was excellent, and with the house all filled with warm grow lights, good smells, low chatter from the TV, and the two of them bantering, Nick realized how easy it was not to worry about who might or might not be lurking around outside. The closed blinds and locked doors felt safe, regardless of how safe they really were. The sofa was long enough to fit Vash's gangly limbs all sprawled out, so of course it was plenty big enough to fit both of them, Nick against an armrest, Vash's shoulders against his chest. Nick rested his elbow on the top of Vash's head, sipped from his after-dinner rocks glass of whiskey, and asked, "What's the plan now?" "Dunno," Vash said, which sounded like a lie. Nick leaned down to the side of his face and kissed his neck. "Try again," he said. Vash squirmed, holding his own whiskey out of the way to keep it upright. "Movie," he said hurriedly. "Yeah? Okay." "Star Wars?" "Why you asking me? It's your pick." Vash huffed. "I don't like feeling bossy, or like you're just humoring me." Nick leaned way over and put his drink down on the coffee table so he could properly hold Vash around the chest and lean down to his ear. "I want to see your favorite movie," he murmured. "I want to know you. I want to know what you love. I want to love it too. Not just humoring you." Vash's breathing had gone unsteady. He sucked in air while Nick pressed his lips under his ear and then tugged gently at his piercing, tongue brushing Vash's earlobe. Swallowing, Vash said, mixed messages." Nick drew back, chuckling, and pushed at Vash's shoulder. "Movie," he said cheerfully, and Vash whined at the teasing. But he got up anyway, went to fuss with the devices under the TV, and pulled a box much too chunky for DVDs out of the bottom of the milk crate shelf. "Is that tape?" Nick asked, wriggling to get more comfy on the sofa and reaching out to grab his drink. Vash slid off a cardboard sleeve and held out the box set inside proudly. "These were REMs," he said. "From the 80s, back before those remasters where they made a bunch of changes. You can't even buy the original cuts anymore. These things are probably the only valuable antique I own." It took a little while to get the old clunky VCR all sorted out, and to find the remote for it and fiddle with the tracking to make fuzzy horizontal lines stop dragging through the picture, but Vash got it all set up before the set of ancient movie trailers ended. The grow lights placed throughout the living room were on a day-night cycle timer, so they were already starting to dim. Vash hesitated in front of the couch, then paused the tape and asked, "Actually, do you mind?" Nick sighed and said, "I don't mind shit, Spiky. I just have no idea what you're asking if I mind half the time." Vash made a face at him. "If I take my arm off," he grumbled. It made the pit of Nick's stomach ache that Vash still felt like his body was somehow weird or unacceptable. Like Nick might not mind his asymmetry when they were asleep, but that if Nick spent too much time getting a good look at Vash while they were awake, he might finally realize that Vash was monstrous. But Nick just said, "Get comfy, man. Get in stump pajamas. I don't care." He couldn't see how pink Vash went in the dimness of the room, but he was sure it was there. 10 minutes later, with refreshed drinks and an armful of boyfriend Sans Lim reclined against him on the couch, they started the movie. It was damn good. Nick was engrossed immediately, and barely registered finishing off his drink or moving around so that a squirming Vash could get in a better position. He leaned his elbow on the armrest and his head in his palm, other hand idly picking at a loose thread on the collar of Vash's shirt, and the time flew. Every now and then he would hear Vash muttering under his breath, but it took him a few times to realize it was Vash mouthing lines to himself, watching the screen and grinning like a doofus. He blinked when credits began to roll. Vash looked up at him, hopeful. Instead of saying he liked it, Nick checked the time. "It's only 8, he said. "There's more of these, right?" Vash's face filled with glee. He rolled off the couch, victory punched the air, and hissed, "Yes, marathon!" "Maybe not all of them," Nick said, alarmed. While Vash got the tape switched out, Nick went and changed into sleep clothes. Short sleeves, because Vash kept the house pretty balmy. He went down the hall, poking his head behind doors to find the bathroom, and accidentally found himself looking into an immaculate bedroom. Blank walls, bookshelves filled with academic journals and notebooks, bed made with hospital corners. Nick shut the door immediately, not wanting to snoop on Ive's space. But after he found the bathroom, he couldn't help picking over the image in his mind while he went through the motions. It wasn't until he was drying his hands that he realized there hadn't been a single plant in the room. No hint of green, of anything living. Just bed, desk, chair, shelves, closed window. Ive's bedroom looked like a prison cell. Nick grimaced, shook his head, and went back out to join Vash on the couch. Vash's incomprehensibly strange twin wasn't his problem right now. He flopped onto the sofa, put his feet up on the coffee table, and dragged Vash sideways into his lap. Vash spluttered and flailed, barely managing to hold on to the remote. "Hey! Come on, time's wasting. Indoctrinate me into more of your nerd shit." Nick ran his hand through Vash's hair, knocking it out of his style. Vash wriggled himself more comfortable, leveraging his head up onto Nick's lap with a stump and leaving his right arm free to use the remote. He punched a couple of buttons, and the VCR made an alarming whir and thunk. "You broke it," Nick said. "No." Vash laid there for a moment, then pushed another couple of buttons. The machine started to whir continuously in a lighter tone. It wasn't rewound. He went oddly quiet. Nick mussed his hair some more, scratched slightly at the back of his head, but Vash didn't press into it or sigh contentedly like he usually did. At length, Nick asked, "What is it?" Vash sighed. His head was turned so that Nick couldn't see his face. "Just trying to remember," he said. "When was the last time? It's been so long since I watched these. I think—" He went quiet again for a moment, and then, in a small voice, he said, "I think I haven't rewound this since Rem died." Nick frowned. He ran his hand comfortingly down Vash's neck to his back. "You okay?" Vash cleared his throat lightly. Yeah, it's fine." "You're sure?" Nick murmured. Vash waved the remote dismissively. Yeah, it's not that big of a deal." They listened to the tape deck whir for another minute or two. "Knives and I both loved these when we were kids," Vash finally added. "One of the biggest things we shared. We'd fight over who got to be Luke and who had to be Leia, you know? Twin thing." Vash paused. "Sorry, spoilers." Nick chuckled. "Don't worry, I know that one from cultural osmosis," he said. "And what, you, identifying with a blonde farm boy twink who lives out in the desert? I can't imagine why." Vash gave a true, loud laugh and rolled his face up to look at Nick. "Oh, just wait." Finally, the tape clunked to a halt. Vash fired it up and had to fuss with the tracking all over again. It was a very good movie. That wasn't the problem. The problem, Nick found, was that Vash's head was a warm, comfortable weight on his thighs, and that pasta and whiskey metabolized into pure knockout drugs. Around the halfway mark, he'd caught himself dozing off twice. Finally, he had to nudge Vash up and twist himself into a couple of stretches just to stay awake. "Bored?" Vash teased when he yawned. "Getting a second wind," Nick retorted, determined. "It's not even 10, Vash said, putting on an exaggerated look of disappointment. "You're so old." "I'm the same age as you fucking—" Vash laughed and dodged the attempted noogie, and the momentary roughhousing woke Nick up enough to push through the rest of the movie. Vash settled upright this time, leaning against Nick's shoulder, his socked feet propped up next to Nick's bare ones on the coffee table. At the very end of the movie, as the camera panned over a medical droid poking at wires in Luke's mechanical hand, Nick ruffled Vash's hair again and said, "A one-handed blonde farm twink from the middle of nowhere." Vash poked him in the side, but he was laughing. "Right? Also, stop saying twink." "You dare deny what you are?" "I am not—" Another bout of headlocks and kicking shins ensued, which ended with Vash hiccuping against laughter as Nick discovered that his armpits were ticklish, and he wasn't equipped to fend Nick off if he went for the left side. Stop! Ha! Vash finally managed to knee Nick in the kidney, and Nick doubled over with an exaggerated wheeze. On the TV, credits were rolling over sweeping music. Vash propped his head on Nick's shoulder, muttering, "Not a twink." Nick kissed his hair. "Nothing wrong with it. You're just a twig." He wrapped an arm around Vash's thin waist for emphasis. Vash snorted. "Hey, I lost a big chunk of intestine, okay? That's why I don't get all I'm supposed to out of food even when I eat a lot." He poked his stomach, where Nick knew the scar ran next to his belly button. "Oh, shit," Nick said, startled. He moved his squeezing hand up to Vash's chest. "Sorry, Vash made an annoyed noise and grabbed Nick's arm, pressing his own along it to prevent Nick from moving. "For fuck's sake, it's not like a surgery I had yesterday," he said, pushing Nick's arm back down to his stomach. Okay. Nick half laughed in surrender and grabbed a handful of Vash's all but non-existent belly to squeeze. It made Vash snort with laughter. "I like this," Vash said, settling down firmly into Nick's side. "When you don't act like I'm fragile, I mean." "Fragile," Nick muttered disbelievingly. "I've watched you at work. You're a machine. No offense to any cyborgs in the room," he added. Vash giggled. "Yeah, I know you've watched me at work," he said suggestively. "Shut it, Spiky," Nick said. "I can't help that my office has a good view." Vash grinned. The credits ran down to the very end. Vash finally had to disentangle himself from Nick to find the remote and stop the tape. He got the long process of rewinding started, the gentle, high-pitched whir the only background noise in the room now that all the grow lights had gone dark and weren't emitting their gentle fluorescent hum. "So Knives has to concede that you're the Luke twin now, I assume," Nick said, as Vash leaned back against him. Instead of laughing, though, Vash got quiet. Nick scrubbed his fingers against the back of his scalp. "Oh no, what did I say?" he murmured. Vash leaned back more firmly, watching the numbers tick backwards on the VCR display. No, it's nothing. It's just... He sighed. I haven't talked to Knives about Star Wars since we were kids. He wouldn't want to, I don't think. Nick frowned, eyes flicking to the hallway door. Thought about the prison cell bedroom. I've never known someone with so little sense of humor, he said, and it came out more irritable than he'd meant. He had his own private opinion of Knives, but he didn't mean to go around blatantly showing Vash that he thought his brother was a joyless asshole who seemed to just be a millstone around Vash's neck. Nick had a little more social decorum than that. They sat in silence until the tape finally clunked to a halt. Vash sat there fiddling with the remote, not moving, for another long minute. Nick had the sinking feeling that he'd stepped on some hidden landmine, and he was already trying to formulate apologies in his head for a misstep he didn't even know where he'd taken. Into the quiet, Vash said, "It's guilt." Nick had just opened his mouth to start apologizing. He closed it, ran his fingers through Vash's hair again, made a soft questioning noise. Haltingly, Vash said, This. He shrugged his left shoulder against Nick's side. He was at the controls of the Combine. Aunt Mary, a family friend, not actually an aunt. Mary was teaching both of us, but I'd already had my turn. It wasn't supposed to be on, but he was at the controls. He hit something. Vash trailed off. Nick felt sick. Vash leaned his head back onto Nick's shoulder. He passed out. I passed out. I don't remember, but Rem told me. He was out cold for a couple days. Had badly mixed up memory of the whole week. Trauma response? But he knew he'd done it. He always felt like it was his fault. Maybe it was, but it was all an accident. I shouldn't have been where I was. It was both our faults. Mary's, too, for not checking safety enough. I don't know. I hate assigning fault anyway, anywhere. It doesn't matter. It happened, so just leave it behind, you know? But that guilt's always been there for him. So he doesn't have a sense of humor about it. I learned to. I had to. He turned his face into Nick's neck, and Nick could hear the soft smile in his voice when he said, I like that you'll joke about it. Feels good. Feels normal. Nick ran his hand down to Vash's upper arm and held his bicep right above where it ended. Under his shirt, Vash had on a thick, warm sock over his stump. I'm sorry, he said quietly, turning his face to press lips to Vash's temple. What for? Vash asked. Nick almost said the accident, but he paused, parsed his thoughts for a moment. He shouldn't apologize for something he wasn't there for, had no part in. So he said, For thinking badly of your brother. I'll cut him more slack. Vash snorted softly. Nah, he's a dick, he said fondly. You know, he was the biggest crybaby when we were really little. Clingy. I do think a lot of how he is now is still some edgelord bullshit he hasn't completely shed from being an overcompensating teenager. He laughed. God, he's such a dork. I love him. Nick smiled into Vash's hair, thinking about Livio. He understood how Vash felt more completely than Vash could know. I'm glad to have him back, Vash added. Even if there's, stalkers? Baggage, Vash said diplomatically. Nick snorted. How do you think he's doing over at Chez Rousseau? Vash wrinkled his nose. Hopefully I'll never know. Nick grinned wickedly and dropped his hand from Vash's arm to his waist. He dragged his fingers lightly over Vash's shirt. Bet he's having a nice time, Nick said into Vash's ear, low. He rucked Vash's shirt up slightly, got fingers against his skin. Bet all kinds of new developments are happening now that the flirting's out of cyberspace. Quit it. Nick withdrew his hand. Sorry, he said, absolutely not sorry. Forgot you were ticklish. Vash groaned and grabbed at Nick's hand, drawing it back down and then up his chest under his shirt. You're such a bastard, Vash told him. Nick bent his head, mouthed at Vash's ear piercing, and then kissed his neck. Ticklish here? You know I'm not. Vash wriggled around, got up on his knees, and then flung a leg over to straddle Nick's lap. He dipped forward but withdrew when Nick tried to meet him. With a smirk, Vash said, Do not mention knives again until tomorrow at the earliest. Solemn promise. Nick held Vash's hips and moved suggestively. Just concern for his well-being, he said, all innocence. Vash leaned forward again, and in a low, seductive voice, he said, You want to sleep on this couch tonight, Smokestack? Nick burst out laughing, and Vash finally kissed him, and Nick had no problem upholding a solemn promise not to break the mood with any further mention of Vash's problematic twin.